The United States of America has begun taking active steps to effectively seize control of Cuba. European companies are urgently leaving Cuba right now and are hastily getting rid of their assets on the island. Meanwhile, Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel issued an urgent address calling for immediate dialogue with the United States. The thing is, earlier Donald Trump himself publicly stated that he would deal with Cuba as soon as he was finished with Iran. But on the same day, the United States of America announced the imposition of sanctions against the president of Cuba and his trusted associates. Moreover, these sanctions, which might not seem all that harsh, didn't just target the Cuban president's inner circle, they also affected European companies. Previously, the US had only tightened the blockade of the islands, not even allowing a Russian tanker with petroleum products to pass through. And now the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation has made an official statement saying that, in their opinion, dark clouds are gathering over Cuba because the US is planning a military attack on the island, right before the congressional elections in November of this year. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Leave any comment you like and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in the description of this video. So, the United States has imposed new sanctions against the authorities in Cuba, but not only against the authorities, and here we need to look into it. The sanctions, introduced on Thursday following Trump's signing of an executive order to expand measures against the island, freeze the assets and accounts of individuals in the United States. Donald Trump's administration imposed sanctions against Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel, his wife, and 3 other individuals. According to a statement signed by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, those who are subject to the sanctions, quote, lead the regime or finance it, as well as its efforts to mobilize radical revolutionary movements in the United States and around the world. This move was immediately condemned in Havana. President Díaz-Canel stated that this is political blindness, quote. It adds to the punitive measures taken in recent weeks against our country and aimed at harming the Cuban people. Alejandro Castro Espín was also sanctioned. He is the only son of former Cuban leader Raúl Castro and Vilma Espín. He was an advisor to the Cuban Commission on Defense and National Security and, by the way, was present when Raúl Castro welcomed then US President Barack Obama in Havana, during the historic meeting in March 2016. The sanctions list also includes Castro Espín's son, Raúl Alejandro Castro Cáliz, and the measures introduced on Thursday following Trump's signing of an order to expand sanctions against the island provide for the freezing of property and bank accounts belonging to these individuals in the US. It remains unclear here to what extent their financial interests are actually connected to the American system. Because, well, it's quite unlikely that, for example, the president of Cuba and other individuals involved have assets or bank accounts in the United States. Nevertheless, the new sanctions are being imposed against the backdrop of threats by US President Trump to use military force against Cuba, after he overthrew Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela in January and imposed an energy blockade, cutting off oil supplies to Cuba. This blockade has led to severe power outages, food shortages, and economic collapse across the island this year. These threats gained additional weight after the United States announced criminal charges against Raúl Castro last month. Therefore, the latest sanctions can be seen as preparation for intervention or as increased pressure on the regime in Cuba to force it into a deal. At the same time, the rhetoric of Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio may indicate either the first or the second scenario. And so, when asked on Thursday whether the sanctions are aimed at accelerating the collapse of Cuba, Trump said, quote, "We just want them to have a properly managed country. The country is starving. It has no electricity, no oil, no money. It has nothing. But it does have wonderful territory. There could be great resorts there. Cuba has already collapsed in a sense. We'll deal with it as soon as we finish the military operation in Iran. I like to handle one thing at a time." But just a few hours after these sanctions were imposed, the scale became clear, and it became clear why they were introduced. European companies, from Spanish hotel groups to German and French shipping companies, are urgently ceasing their operations in Cuba and rushing to sell off their assets on the island. It is reported that among the hardest hit are the Spanish hotel groups Melia and Iberostar. For decades, the luxury resorts they operated on Cuba's beaches were the jewels of their global portfolios. Objectively speaking, Melia, the Spanish company, managed a huge number of Cuban hotels, and this was its main asset. But now the company is withdrawing from managing all its hotels in Cuba and is rushing to sell them as quickly as possible. The thing is, US sanctions have affected not only the president of Cuba and his people. The sanctions have also affected foreign companies doing business with Cuban state entities, especially with the military conglomerate Geisa. They risked asset freezes and exclusion from the US financial system. European companies operating in sectors ranging from shipping and logistics to energy, agriculture, and even alcohol production are now desperately getting rid of their assets on the island and rushing to leave it. For example, back in May, the French shipping giant CMA-CGM suspended its operations in Cuba. I should note that this company accounts for almost half of all Cuban maritime shipments. And here is the essence of the new sanctions. Washington's goal is to break the partnerships that have long formed the basis of economic ties between Cuba and Europe. And now the US has targeted the Cuban military company Geisa. This is a shadowy mega-conglomerate that controls about 40% of Cuba's economy and in fact belongs to the president and his inner circle. This state-owned enterprise, whose finances are strictly classified, manages Cuba's banking system, gas stations, supermarkets, and, importantly, most of the tourism sector. More than half of the hotels in Cuba are owned by Geisa's subsidiary Gaviota, and almost all of them are managed by foreign hotel groups, such as the Spanish company Melia. And now they're all leaving the island because it's become clear that, well, it's no longer possible to work with Geisa, it's dangerous. But that's not all. For example, even the famous Havana Club rum, I'm sure you've all seen it, is produced as part of a joint venture between the French beverage giant Pernod Ricard and the Cuban state company Cubaron. Now this rum might simply disappear because the French are quickly leaving Cuba and saying, no, we need to cut ties with the Cuban company. And only after all this did the Cuban authorities suddenly call for dialogue, but in their usual manner. The country's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, stated, and I quote, "We believe that dialogue is necessary. There are many issues we're open to discussing. For example, American investments in Cuba and American companies doing business in Cuba. But Cuba does not intend to discuss a possible change of power on the island and would prefer to focus on economic issues. For example, to discuss the possibility of easing the naval blockade of the island by the United States." And of course, what story like this would be complete without the Russians, who stick their noses into everything? The head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, stated, and I quote, "Clouds are gathering over Cuba, because the US is planning to take very, very dangerous steps toward the island before the congressional elections in November of this year." And so, according to Lavrov, with the help of an operation against Cuba, the White House may try to prove the success of the Republican administration right before the elections. Well, anyway, whatever the case may be, the US is really tightening the noose around Cuba's neck more and more. Obviously, in the hope that even without a military operation, Cuba will fall or enter into some kind of dialogue that is acceptable to Washington. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and hit the bell icon. And if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone. Goodbye everyone. To be continued.